Well, Rebecca, welcome to Grace Community Church in a sort of a virtual way in Bedford. Thank you so much for being willing to spend some time with us. Why don't you tell us a little bit, where in the world are you right now?
Right now, I'm in a place that is called Cambridge, but ought to be called New Cambridge, because it is in fact in New England, in America. And whereas they say New England and New York, they fail to say New Cambridge. There is a town not far from here that's also called Bedford and ought to be called New Bedford. But yeah, so that's where I am right now is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm a stone's throw from MIT. I can see some of the MIT buildings out of my window here. And you'd have to be really good at throwing stones to hit Harvard, but Harvard's not far off either. So I'm kind of in the intellectual capital of America.
Amazing. And I said earlier when we connected that you look like you're in a very peaceful place right now, but in fact, you're not on your own there, are you? What's your kind of family situation there?
Well, our family situation has just been changed as of last weekend because my in-laws have come to stay for a few weeks.
Amazing.
They come from Oklahoma debatably whether it's in the South or the Midwest or somewhere in America. Nobody quite wants to claim Oklahoma for their own, but it's somewhere down there. So yeah, I'm married to Brian, who is from Oklahoma. We have 3 children who are 10, 8, and 2. And I'm in, it's my bedroom, which is where I end up doing most of my work in ministry these days. And it's the only room that doesn't have kids cavorting around and interrupting things.
So relative peace is the term.
Relative,
absolute.
Yes.
And in Cambridge, in the northeast of America, do you, as well as looking after 3 children and a husband and a household and all those kind of things, what else that fills your time? Work-wise, pursuits-wise.
I've had a really interesting just over a decade here. We've been here 12 years, I think. So just to give you a little context, I met Brian right when I was finishing up my PhD and he was in the midst of his. I then went to Oak Hill Theological College in London, and we were sort of longish distance, not very long distance, for a year or so before getting married. And so then he dragged me kind of kicking and screaming across to America. And I honestly, I wasn't really sure what God was up to, because I had a deep passion for gospel work in the UK. I had no desire to move to America at all. The visa people wondered if I'd only married Brian so that I could move to America, and actually it was only because I'd married Brian that I had any remote possibility of moving to America in my thoughts. But what God then had me do was spend nearly a decade working for a ministry called the Veritas Forum, where a big piece of my role was to work with Christian professors at leading kind of world-class universities. As I mentioned, we're close to MIT and Harvard, but also places like Princeton and Stanford and Berkeley, et cetera, and also to some extent with universities in the UK, and to help them think about how to speak about their faith in Jesus in the university context. And that was amazing, because I basically got to talk with some of the cleverest Christians in the world, who were experts in everything from astrophysics to psychology, and to hear from them why they find Jesus to be the most compelling answer to the most important questions. And after that process, I was working at that organization for 9 years. And I felt after that like I had almost a roadmap of where the conversation really is at when it comes to Christianity, and where the top thinkers in a whole range of fields have their minds at the moment. And so I wrote a book coming out of that called Confronting Christianity, looking at 12 of the biggest objections that people have to the Christian faith, and trying to basically mine the Christian professors who I'd worked with, and actually also the atheist and agnostic professors I'd engaged with for where their thinking was. And through that process to argue that Christianity remains the greatest intellectual movement in all of history, the greatest movement for justice in all of history, the greatest movement for women in all of history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I wrote that book a couple of years ago. The last year or so has been an interesting sort of whirlwind coming out of that. I just finished the kids version of the book, which will come out next March. So I spent quite a lot of time writing. I'm actually right now writing a Christmas book for next Christmas in the middle of August. So that's weird. but also fun. So I write, I do various online speaking things. I was traveling around doing speaking things, but no more thanks to our friendly global pandemic.
Of course.
I hang out with my kids and I spend time with friends who are really important to me.
Wonderful. That's amazing. And I was going to say, we're really looking forward. We've got your book here. And we're, after this Sunday, in the Sundays coming, we're going to spend 5 Sundays looking at some of the topics you pull out. I found it very helpful myself, and hopefully others will do too as we kind of work our way through it. So you're a Brit plucked out of your natural habitat, and but you do have some connection, don't you, to Bedford itself?
I absolutely do. My beloved grandparents, my mum's parents, live on Putney Lane, if you're familiar with that. And they've lived there all my life, though they actually come from the north, from Barrow and Furness originally, and they have beautiful northern accents they have managed to preserve over the 50 odd years they've lived on Putney Lane. So yeah, I've spent many happy hours in Bedford, and it feels like a kind of second town home, as it were. I grew up mostly in London, but Bedford was
that's
special place to
I
me.
think that's a great comfort that you're able to say that you spent many happy hours in Bedford. I meet a lot of people from Bedford, and they seem quite down on Bedford. I'm not a Bedford native myself.
But you know what? My grandma was the headmistress of a Catholic primary school in Bedford, and so there are generations of Bedford folk who will go up to my grandma on the street and sort of say hello, because they remember her so fondly. She was an outstanding teacher.
Oh, fantastic. So a real part of the kind of social history of Bedford as well. That's lovely. That's really nice. It's lovely to have those roots, isn't it, in different places. And I mean, you sound like kind of, dare I say it, a professional Christian now. You've written a book from a Christian point of view. You are using a lot of your time to talk about the Christian message. Is that because, I mean, have you always been a Christian? What's your story, kind of looking back, and how you got to this place where you're so, you seem so confident in being able to talk about, your faith?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I had the blessing of being brought up in a church-going family. We actually, because my mum's family is Catholic, my dad's family is sort of Church of England, so we had a funny mishmash growing up as kids, of often alternating between a Catholic church and the local Anglican church. I grew up first in a small village near Windsor. And by the time I was about 9, I was pretty sure that Jesus was the only truly rock solid, dependable thing in my life. The only person who couldn't be here today and gone tomorrow. My mum was very, very ill at the time and was hospitalized for a period. It wasn't clear that she was going to survive, and that was a very formative moment for me, of thinking, okay, all the things that I might have placed confidence in could actually be gone tomorrow. And it was clear to me at that point that Jesus was the exception to that rule. I then spent, from when I was about 11 onwards, in educational environments that were very sort of academic and generally quite hostile to Christianity. Although, I mean, ironically, I went to a secondary school that was named St. Paul's. It was sort of dedicated to the Apostle Paul, and we sang hymns in assembly every morning. But actually, that was basically me singing extremely loudly while 600 other people sort of looked at me like I was a weirdo. And so, but it was nice in a sense that school was one where it was kind of okay to be different. So I feel like I spent most of my formative years in environments where I was often the only Christian, and engaging in sort of frank conversations with very clever friends and teachers who really disagreed with me. And I think in some ways that's sort of continuous with where I'm at now, of wanting to think about Christianity from the perspective, not just of those who you already feel persuaded of it, but actually also to look through the eyes of friends who find Christianity intellectually bankrupt and morally corrupted. So where it's this interesting combination, and I see this a lot amongst friends in America now, of feeling like, on the one hand, Christianity is a delusion, but actually it's worse than that. It's a delusion that causes evil in the world.
Yes.
And I think that's a massive misunderstanding. And I think it's a misunderstanding that even if you're not ultimately convinced by the Christian faith, that if we look at the evidence, you find it's not the case at all.
Yes.
But so I've been kind of engaged in that project of trying to listen well and hear well people who take an opposing view, and then sort of argue, actually, when we look at the evidence and when we compare Christianity to any other belief system, we find that it comes out extraordinarily well.
Yeah, that comes across so strongly in your book. And it sounds just from your story there that as you went through these different stages with school, which is a bit of a crucible, I don't know what your experience at university was like, but at each stage, it was almost more training to kind of think through what you believed and share it and test it almost against what other peers thought. Did you ever find yourself doubting? You said at 9 you had that kind of rock solid certainty that Jesus was the one thing that was secure, eternal, where everything else was fragile or tenuous. Did you ever have any period in those sort of years where you something made you think, I'm not sure actually? Yes.
There's a moment in the Gospels when a lot of people are turning away from Jesus, and he turns to his sort of closest disciples and says, sort of, what about you? And the response is, well, where else have we to go? If we stop following you, where else have we to go? You have the words of eternal life. And one of the things that's been interesting to me over the years that I've engaged as thoroughly as I can with non-Christian points of view, both religious and non-religious, I actually come out of that feeling more persuaded by Christianity rather than less. I mean, you might think that would kind of cause you to doubt your faith, but
sure.
As I look at Christianity among other options, despite the fact that Christianity honestly requires me to believe some completely crazy things. I mean, like I said, I'm writing this book about Christmas. I was like, a man who was miraculously born of a virgin and then, miraculously raised from the dead. I mean, crazy, miraculous things that we Christians have to believe. But actually, we're not comparing Christianity to a perfectly coherent secular worldview that does all the work that Christianity does for us without having to believe in crazy things. We're actually comparing Christianity to far more crazy things as the other options. So I haven't actually, in the course of this process, ever come to a point where I've thought, oh, that really causes me to question my faith, honestly, because I think it's seeing the alternatives almost, well, it does make Christianity shine more brightly.
Of course, yeah, amazing. And right at the beginning of your book, you talk about all that. In some ways, it feels like there are two competing tales stories we can tell about the universe. There's one which is secular, material, and one which is spiritual. That there is an element, whichever God you would want to believe in, but there is a presence outside our world, a God. And I think you said in the beginning of your book that as Christians in the West, we feel like in the battle between those two stories, we are very much on the losing side. Like you said, to believe in Christianity requires us to believe crazy things. I think which actually make us feel embarrassed, maybe ashamed, certainly nervous in sharing what we believe. Why do you think that is? I mean, firstly, why do you think we feel like we're on the defensive? And is it a correct feeling, do you think?
Part of the reason is that we have actually a very parochial view of the world. When I was born, most sociologists of religion, pretty much all of them actually, thought that as the world became more modern and more educated, more scientific, that religious belief globally would naturally decline. And that's the story that we told ourselves in the West. And that's the story that to some extent has played out in Western Europe. And the argument went, where Western Europe leads, the rest of the world must follow. Now, looking back, we can see that was actually quite a kind of white Western imperialist view of the world. It is still very widely believed, including actually among some of the cleverest professors at leading universities around here, that actually belief in God in general and Christianity in particular is basically on the way out. And so why would we even take the time to seriously consider the claims of Jesus when, maybe your grandparents believe that, possibly your parents, you probably not, your kids definitely not, kind of thing, that we're on this trajectory, and that the world is realizing that actually, we'd just be better off without religious belief. Now, if we look at what's happening globally, it's a very different story. That actually, Christianity today is the world's largest belief system, with about 31% of the world identifying as Christian. Now, of course, whether every individual in that set is, genuinely an authentic follower of Jesus is another question. But just thinking about how people self-identify, about 31% of the world identifies as Christian. If we look forward over the next 40 years to 2060, that proportion is set to increase actually to about 32%. So just a small increase, but Christianity remains the largest global belief system. Islam is expected to shoot up from about 25% to about 31%, so becoming a very close competitor with Christianity. Buddhism and Hinduism are set to decline slightly. And the proportion of people who aren't affiliated with a major world religion, so including atheists, agnostics, and people who are just sort of tick none on a census form that they're not affiliated with anything in particular, that proportion is set to decline from about 16% now to about 13%.
Sure.
And what's even more interesting there is that actually China right now is the global center of atheism. So an awful lot of people in that current 16% are living in communist China, where atheism is pretty much mandated and where Christianity is strongly persecuted. But the church in China is growing so fast that experts believe in the next 5 years there'll be more Christians in China than in America, and that some experts actually think that by 2060 China could be a majority Christian country. So this idea that Christianity, well, belief in God in general, Christianity in particular, is sort of basically waning, has simply been discredited by what's actually been happening.
Yeah, the facts don't lie.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think part of the reason why a lot of sociologists of religion, a few decades ago, thought as the world matures, as it were, as the globe grows up, we'll sort of shed our religious belief, is because that's kind of what they'd done.
Sure.
And actually, it turns out that not believing in God, not having any kind of religious framework, so it's a really hard way to live. It's not a way that seems to produce human flourishing across a number of.
We might come back to that. That's a really interesting insight. Now, I think we've come to you because I think once you write a book, you're probably an expert. Probably, I'm sure you won't. I'm sure you won't like that label. But
I tell you what, I am. I'm not an expert, but I know an awful lot of experts. I only trust the things that they say. I'm a curator of experts.
But that's a very happy place to be. So I thought we might ask you for some advice. Now, in our series, we're going to be diving into some of the things that we might say on particular issues and topics in terms of the what we might say. But I wonder, just from your experience of talking to your friends, being on different mission events, have you got any kind of advice for us in terms of how we would engage with people? Because I think when we get asked difficult questions, I think sometimes as Christians we feel certainly straight away we can very easily feel stumped. We can feel defensive, worried that we won't say the right thing. All kinds of things rush the front of our brain as we think about how we might speak. So have you got any thoughts about, as Christians, how we can talk to our friends who've got questions about what we believe?
Yeah, for sure. I think first, our manner as we engage in non-believers needs to be obedient to what the New Testament tells us about how our manner should be when we engage non-believers. So Peter says that we should always be willing, ready to give a reason for the hope that we have, but that we should do so with gentleness and respect. And it's interesting that those two terms are not ones that you would necessarily associate with every sort of fiery Christian apologist, to be honest.
Sure.
Gentleness and respect. So that's a starting point. And also, Paul talks about us being compelled by Christ's love as we persuade people. So the first thing that we need to do, and that we need to sort of fight for in our own hearts and in our conversations, is, are we speaking in love? Are we being gentle? And are we showing respect for the other person? one of my favorite lecturers at Oak Hill, a wonderful guy named James Robson, who now heads up the Keswick Convention, he had this great clarifying distinction which he made, which is, people often say you should respect other people's opinions and beliefs. And he said, that's rubbish. You shouldn't respect other people's beliefs. You should respect other people. And I think we often confuse that to where we either don't behave respectfully toward other people, or we think respecting other people's beliefs means never questioning or challenging them. Actually, I think that the best way to respect somebody else's beliefs is to take them seriously. And that means being willing to say if we disagree and if we think that they're wrong, and being willing to ask them to look at other evidence and being willing to listen to the evidence that they have. And I think we make this big mistake, and I feel like we've kind of, at least my generation, was sort of raised culturally on the idea that it was highly offensive to question somebody else's religious beliefs, that it was somehow sort of an attack on their personhood. And I don't think that's right. I think there are offensive ways that we can question somebody else's beliefs. But ultimately, if I say to, for example, a Hindu friend who grew up in an Indian family, if I approach them as if they are only constrained by their cultural background, I'm not really respecting them as a thinking person who has the right to change their mind.
Sure.
And I think just connected to that, there's another anxiety that we can sometimes have, particularly those of us who, like me, are kind of white Westerners and carry with us this complex history of white Westerners evangelizing to people of color in other countries, and how sometimes that was done well and sometimes that was done extremely poorly, sometimes that was well motivated, sometimes it was motivated horribly. We can kind of carry with that a sense of guilt or sheepishness about sharing the gospel of Jesus with somebody, particularly if they have a different cultural background to us. And I think there it's really helpful for us to remember, actually, white Westerners like me are the minority when it comes to global Christianity. And I often say this in America, the person in America most likely to be a Christian is a black woman, actually not a white. If you stop rounding people on the street, if you were trying, if I said, John, I'm going to give you £100 if you can walk down the street and settle upon an actual Christian, you should, in America, absolutely look for black women. You've got a much better chance of that being the case. And globally, that's the case as well. So I think sometimes we forget that Christianity did not start as a white Western religion at all, and that it has always been a multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic movement, and that goes hand in hand with Jesus's command to go and make disciples of all nations, rather than sort of awkwardly pulling against it. So I think we need to have that posture of gentleness, respect, and love. I think we need to have the confidence to say that actually you and I may have our own kind of limited cultural perspective on anything, but that doesn't invalidate the global truth claims of Christianity, or mean that we couldn't and shouldn't try and share our faith with somebody from a very different background. And I think thirdly, I would, let's avail ourselves of the resources that God has given us in some of the cleverest Christians in the world. So none of us is an expert on everything from astrophysics to psychology to history to New Testament studies, but we can actually access experts on those questions. And I think one of the helpful things we can say in conversation with a friend is, gosh, I don't know, that's a really good question, let me do a bit of reading on that, or I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but actually I know of somebody who does, maybe we can read their book together, or watch a video, or read an article. So just to kind of use the experts God has given us.
There's so many resources, I guess, that we can find. I wonder if I could just ask you a bit about your personal experience, kind of just where you are in the community you live in. Just on that kind of from a sharing the Christian message kind of point of view, do you find yourself just stumbling over opportunities to do that all the time? Is it something you feel like you have to create the opportunities? yeah, what's your experience in that whole kind of area of having the opportunity to do this sort of thing?
I'm actually going to dial back a little bit to when I was a student, because since finishing up my PhD and going to Oak Hill, I have been, as you said, a professional Christian. So if I meet somebody and they ask me, what do you do? Unless I lie to them, I have to tell them but I can kind of sort of say, well, I write things. You know, I can be a little cagey if I really want to be, but basically I have to tell them I'm a Christian. And so that there are opportunities there, but probably not what, you know, the typical person in any local church is going to experience. When I was an undergrad, I would often ask people to tell me what they were passionate about. And I'd listen to them and be interested in that. And they'd often ask me back what I was passionate about, and I'd tell them about Jesus. Now, that's a relatively blunt instrument, but I think there's a transferable principle there, that if we show genuine interest in other people's experiences and stories and ideas, they may also be interested in ours. And it doesn't have to be a kind of contest in a sense, but it does give us an opportunity to share our faith. And I think we shouldn't assume. I always remember I was involved in one of the missions when I was an undergrad, and the way that we did it at Cambridge was you were kind of given a list of all the students in your college, and then the list was broken down by person, and you were kind of given your list of like, here are the people whose doors you're going to knock on to say, hi, here's a gospel, would you like to come to a talk about Jesus? And I remember getting this list, and on this list was this incredibly like cool and beautiful girl called Claire in my year, who I didn't really know at all. I mean, I just sort of knew that she was one of the cool people, and I really wasn't. I was so dreading knocking on. I put her name like right to the bottom of my to-do list. And eventually I went and knocked on her door and sort of sheepishly stammered out, here's the gospel, I wonder if you'd be interested in coming to this talk on Jesus, expecting it to be like literally slammed in my face. And she said, yeah, I'd actually be really interested. And I was like, what do you mean you'd be really interested? That's not what I was expecting at all. I think sometimes we can discount other people's, or we can so expect people not to be interested in Jesus that we don't actually start the conversations out of, I don't know, fear or shame or whatever it is. And sometimes they don't want to hear, for sure, but actually sometimes, surprisingly, people do want to hear. And often the conversations they might have with us about Jesus could be some of the most meaningful conversations they've had all week.
Ray, who's been a pastor at Grace for decades, he's got a lovely line. He says, don't say other people's no's for them.
Right.
Which
yeah,
I think
exactly.
is a nice way of looking at it, and it just echoes there what you say. I wonder if we could just return to something you started to talk about earlier, which was that idea of having a look at the worldview of Christianity and everything that is delivered by Jesus in the Christian faith compared to a worldview without any sort of supernatural input and what that delivers. And I was just going to ask you, in your experience, again, in conversations with people, where are some of the areas that you find Christianity actually delivers real, satisfying, substantial answers that actually people are aching for, but they haven't really found elsewhere?
I'm going to start just with a Monty Python reference, because I can't use this in America, nobody understands, but I think your people might. I think it's Monty Python, that sketch where it's like, what have the Romans ever done for us? Am I right?
I think so, yeah.
There's a scene in Monty Python where these, I don't know, random peasants in the ancient past are asking, what have the Romans ever done for us? Well, I mean, apart from like roads, and apart from this, and apart from that. And sort of, the comedy of the scene is that the Romans have actually done an extraordinary number of things for them, but they keep asserting this, well, what have the Romans ever done for us? When we think about what Christianity, if we ask ourselves the question in the 21st century West, what has Christianity ever done for us? The litany of answers is longer than my arm. I am in the midst of, and I've been saying this for months because it's a monster, massive book, and it's really hard to review in a short article. But hanging over my head like the sword of Damocles is a review of British historian Tom Holland's book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World.
It is a monster book.
It's a monster. I don't know, have you read it?
I'm about that way far.
You read some of it, okay. So it's like 600 pages long. It's really big. But he's basically making the argument. He's not well, I think he actually possibly may be a Christian now. He's certainly thinking about it. But when he started writing the book, he's not a Christian. And he's looking at the impact of Christianity over the last 2,000 years on particularly Western thinking. And he's arguing that our basic moral ideas, for example, the idea that all human beings are equally, like, intrinsically morally valuable, the idea that there is, such things as human rights that should be afforded to people regardless of their age or sex or race or nationality, the idea that the poor and the weak and the marginalized can make any moral claims on the strong and the rich and the powerful. All of these things actually come to us from Christianity. The things which in America, famously held to be self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, aren't actually self-evident at all. They are specific inheritances from Jesus, actually. And as I talk with non-Christian friends here, that's often a good starting point to say, we have a lot of common ground on certain issues. For example, my non-Christian friends believe passionately in human rights. They believe in racial diversity and love across racial difference, and they think racism is wrong. They believe that men and women are equally morally valuable, and that the poor starving in the slums in Calcutta can make legitimate moral demands on us here now to help them. All of these things have come from Christianity, and one of the things that Tom Holland's good at is he looks at the culture, the broader culture into which Christianity was born 2,000 years ago. And none of this was even, it wasn't just that it wasn't self-evident, it was kind of like bizarre. Why would you think those things? And that actually today, Christianity remains the only real foundation for such beliefs. And I find it interesting as a sort of compliment to Tom Holland. There's a guy called Yuval Noah Harari who wrote another big book called Sapiens. I think it's called A Brief History of Humankind, am I right? And he, again, from not at all a Christian perspective, makes the claim that Christianity is the reason that we think that there are such things as human rights. But he describes that human rights are a Christian fiction. And there's no real reason to believe that they're true, or that humans have natural rights any more than chimpanzees or hyenas or spiders.
He's acknowledging the Christian heritage of these ideas without himself being persuaded.
Yeah,
of
do you know what's weird though?
truth.
What's really strange to me is that Tom Holland makes this argument with a kind of wistfulness about the fact that he's not a Christian, because he kind of sees how bad things are, really, if you pull Christianity out of the picture. Harari seems to be completely unconcerned, which I find particularly odd, as he's an Israeli historian, and I'm sort of thinking, to so freely throw human rights out of the window as a fictional idea for which there is no real grounding is not a move that I would make were I not a Christian, and particularly if I had a strong Jewish heritage. It sort of seems so. I sort of feel like that it leaves this glaring question of like, okay, so what now? We've lost any ability to say this is evil, that is good, and to look at something like the Holocaust and say that was terribly morally wrong.
Well, it does seem, doesn't it, that the logical end point of that is you are in a Nietzschean world of strength is right. It's hard to avoid that conclusion, I think.
Yeah, well, and Nietzsche was very, he was sort of a prophet on this question. He said, when you stop believing in God, you pull the right to Christian ethics out from under your feet. Nothing necessarily remains in your hands. And what most of us have done in the West is kind of tried to keep basic Christian ethics without Christianity, and it crumbles in our fingers.
if those are some of the ways in which the Christian message meets the kind of desires of our hearts and resonates kind of where we are, again, kind of looking on the flip side, also, obviously there are aspects of our culture that are very far removed now from from Christian ethics. What are some of the areas you think where at the moment Christianity is really butting heads? The message of Christianity really butts heads with the way that people think culturally, as groups, as individuals. Yeah, where are the, if you like, the bits where standing up for being Christian is harder at the moment?
Yeah. So this is actually kind of ironic, because on the one hand, the obvious answer to that question is in terms of sexual ethics. But one of the weirdest claims that Christianity made at the beginning was that sex only belonged in marriage between one man and one woman. Now, we tend to have this idea that before the 1960s, everyone was basically had sort of a somewhat Victorian moral stance. And that we are the first, generation or couple of generations with this idea of sort of sexual freedom. Actually, and Tom Holland's very strong on this, the Greco-Roman Empire into which Christianity was born was one in which men at least, now, women is a different question, but men at least were not expected to be faithful to their wives. It was absolutely fine for them to sleep with other women. It was also generally fine for them to sleep with other men. It was fine for them to sleep with their slaves. The thing that mattered, like gay sex was completely fine, so long as you were the penetrator rather than the penetrated, to sort of go into slightly gory detail. The Roman Emperor Nero, who was emperor at the time when much of the New Testament was being written, actually married another man twice publicly. And one time he said dressed up as a woman and married him. I mean, so the bizarreness of the Christian claim that sex only belongs in marriage between one man and one woman was kind of odd and scandalous 2,000 years ago, as it is now. But what's interesting about the contrast between the then and the now here is that whereas in the first century, Christian sexual ethics were competing with sort of Greco-Roman ideas, which were, largely for Roman citizens, anything goes, and that women were definitely considered sort of inferior, and slaves were considered inferior, and even those taking a passive role in sex of whatever sort were considered inferior. What Christianity is competing against now, or that Christian claim that sex belongs in marriage between one man and one woman is competing against now, is actually a set of moral thinking which owes its lifeblood to Christianity. So a lot of the current arguments are, well, there is a population of people who have been historically marginalized and oppressed, LGBT folk, and that's not okay. Now, why do we think that it's not okay to oppress minorities? Well, that's because of Christianity. And that actually there's this idea that everybody should sort of be equally respected, and that sex isn't just a kind of functional thing or something to sort of produce more humans or something kind of just purely about the outworking of our like bestial nature, but that there's actually something really kind of precious and sort of spiritually connected about sex, actually. There's something that speaks to the deepest parts of our identity. And those ideas also actually come out of Christianity. I mean, we have this picture throughout the Bible of God as a faithful, loving husband and his people as an often unfaithful wife. It's a bit like, I mean, we're more familiar with the metaphor of God as father and us as his children. But the marriage metaphor, comes to us throughout the Old Testament prophets. Jesus then steps onto the stage of human history and says he is the bridegroom, which is interesting, one of the ways in which he's claiming to be God of the Old Testament. And then we see in Ephesians 5, Paul presents human marriage as this little sort of scale model of Jesus' love for his church. And then in Revelation, we see this, this massive crowd shouting, the wedding of the Lamb has come, and Jesus' marriage to his church brings heaven and earth together. So this huge metaphor through the scriptures that tells us actually the reason why God made men and women, and the reason why he made marriage, and the reason why he sort of created this very specific kind of intimacy was to give us a little glimpse of how Jesus loves us.
Mm.
And so I think as I have conversations with people in this area, and it's something that, immediately kind of comes up in many settings, because it's one of the most offensive things about Christianity today. First I share my own history of same-sex attraction, which is a whole other story that I talk about in my book. At least they completely dismiss me as a phobic bigot. But then I also kind of want to say, what Christians believe about sex is weirder than you think. It's not just that we sort of have these like odd rules that say you can only have sex with somebody you're married to, and by the way, it has to be a man or a woman depending on the body that you were born into. But we're actually saying something more crazy than that, which is that in this relationship, at its best, we get a glimpse of Jesus' love for us. And that's good news for married people, because actually it sort of both validates and takes the pressure off marriage. Your husband or wife is not there to fulfill all of your relational needs. They're there as a little signpost, Jesus' love. It also takes the pressure off single people, because you may miss out on marriage in this life, as the Apostle Paul did. But if you're trusting in Jesus, you are promised that far greater reality to which human marriage at its best can only, in a very faint way, point. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'm kind of passionate.
I love that. I guess two questions spring to mind. I'm just trying to work out which order to ask them in. I guess as you share that kind of perspective, partly what's behind that discomfort with the Christian message is really, I guess, a reaction to authority, that there could be something or someone out there that has the right to tell me what to do with my body, my life, my values. Do you think that's fair? I mean, how do you find, what ways do you find helpful ways to talk to people who are profoundly anti-authoritarian about the goodness of God's authority?
Yeah. I think there are two threads here. One is, as you say, we have a discomfort with the idea of authority in general. The other is that Christians are seen to some extent legitimately as having lost their moral authority. I see that very clearly in America at the moment. But when people liken, I think it's actually profoundly illegitimate for a number of reasons to liken the gay rights movement to the civil rights movement. However, because so many white Christians acted in utterly unchristian and counter-biblical ways when it came to relating to Black people in America, we've lost the moral authority to speak into a current situation, if that makes sense. So I think there's the twinning of a discomfort with the idea of God having the right to tell us what to do with our lives, and a discomfort with the idea of Christians seemingly taking a moral high ground and dictating to other people what they should and shouldn't do with their own bodies. But to go back to the first piece of your question, which is about God and the moral authority. And actually Sam Albury wrote a great book on this last year, because why does God care who I sleep with? We need to start with the reality that if there is a God who made the universe, which the Bible is claiming, then he made each of us. And so he does actually have rights over us as our creator. And that's something I feel like often people sort of start their gospel presentation with sin, but sin doesn't actually make any sense if we haven't started by talking about God as our creator. There's no, what gives a random sort of third party the right to tell me what to do? Well, he's not a random third party. He's the creator of the universe. He made you and knit you together in your mother's womb. But then we have to think, okay, God made us, but he also cares about us. And when we ask the question, well, why would God care who I sleep with, or what right does he have to tell me what to do? The right that somebody has to tell us what to do depends on the nature of their relationship with us. So, my 8-year-old recently said to me, you're not the boss of me. And I was like, actually, I am. We can have this whole actually, I legitimately right now am the boss of you. Now, that won't be the case forever, but some random woman coming up to you and telling you what to do may not have that right. I, as your mother, do have that right. Or if my husband were to say to me, you don't have the right to tell me who I can and can't sleep with, I'd be like, actually I do, because you promised me 13 years ago that you would only ever sleep with me. So the question of who has the right to tell us what to do depends on the nature of our relationship with that person. And I think that means two things about how we talk with non-Christians about questions around sex. One is that it means, honestly, my friends who are in gay relationships, or my friends who are in monogamous, sort of serial heterosexual monogamous relationships, or my friends who are cohabiting, whatever, or my friends who, you know, are promiscuous, like in whatever sense, their main issue is not who they're sleeping with. Their main issue is that they haven't accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And I shouldn't really expect Christian sexual ethics out of people who don't acknowledge Jesus. So I'm always kind of careful to say when I talk about these questions, like, Christians believe that for Christians, sex only belongs in this context. The sin issues in anybody else's life are going to be myriad, as they are in mine, but we shouldn't kind of go around trying to legislate other people's sex lives as our sort of primary responsibility. Our primary responsibility is actually to tell them about Jesus, and if they come to the point of trusting in him, all sorts of things will flow out of that,
sure,
discipleship wise. And lastly, I find it very interesting how the Apostle Paul, who writes many of the New Testament texts on relevant to this question, though I would say that what Jesus says about marriage is highly relevant as well. You could easily think, well, Paul never got married to anybody. He grew up as like a highly religious, Pharisaical Jew. His posture is probably one of like judgmental, disrespect towards those who are sleeping with people they're not married to. In fact, when we read what Paul actually says, we see him describing himself in his first letter to Timothy as the foremost of sinners. Like right after he's talked about how a bunch of different sins are against God's law, including homosexual relationships, he starts saying that actually the reason he thinks Jesus saved him was to show that even somebody as bad as him could be saved. So he's not looking down on anybody morally, and nor should we be. And I think our friends will often be quick to expect us to be saying, I'm a Christian, so I think I'm better than you are. We actually sort of have to work hard to say, you know what, being a Christian means knowing that I'm morally bankrupt. I'm not here to say that I'm morally better than you, quite the reverse.
That's so helpful. And actually it just leads on to kind of another question I had as you were explaining all that, because as you speak and you unpack these things, the clarity of thinking is lovely and persuasive. But I guess some of us, sometimes when we get that opportunity, it's hard to assemble the ideas in the right order. I guess sometimes there's a role, isn't there, for personal testimony as a sort of a way behind people's defences sometimes, and a way to speak persuasively of the difference Jesus makes. If someone says, I find that really difficult to believe, it's an opportunity to say, oh, this is how it affects me. Have you found that sort of personal testimony at all helpful in answering some of the questions that people have, and persuasive in a different way to just dialogue?
Yeah, I think personal testimony is super helpful, and I do that two ways. I sometimes do that by sharing pieces of my own story.
Sure.
And I just want to say, when it comes to personal testimony, as the mother of 3 kids, I love it when people tell me I've basically always been a Christian, because I want my kids to have boring testimonies like that.
Yes.
I want them never to know a day when they weren't saying Jesus is Lord. So sometimes I'll tell pieces of my own story. Often I will also tell pieces of other people's stories. So I have a dear friend who recently wrote a book earlier this year, who came to Christ when she was an atheist undergraduate at Yale University in a lesbian relationship, no prior interest in Christianity, but her girlfriend broke up with her, and it sort of threw her under existential angst, and she stole a copy of Mere Christianity from a lax Catholic friend, read it in the library at Yale, and ended up becoming a Christian. Sort of completely,
That's
so
quite a route.
What's that?
That is quite a route.
It is quite a route. Born Again This Way is her book.
Oh, is that Rachel Gilson?
Yeah, Rachel Gilson.
Yeah, I saw her interview with Glenn's. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it's a lovely interview. Really
Fantastic.
good.
Yeah. Or I think of my friend Sarah Irving Stonebreaker, who was a PhD student when I was in. She was studying history. She was good friends with my husband, actually more than with me. And at the time when I knew her at Cambridge, was totally an atheist. Came from Australia. She, after Cambridge, went to Oxford to do a postdoc, and while she was there, she went to a series of lectures by a fellow Australian atheist philosophy professor, Peter Singer.
Ah.
And Singer is one of these interesting guys who actually kind of works his atheism through his moral thinking, and argues that we shouldn't treat human beings as equally morally valuable just because they're human, but actually that we should evaluate beings, human or otherwise, on the basis of their capacities of various sorts. And so he would say a human infant is less morally valuable than an adult cow or pig or dog. And as my friend Sarah heard this, she felt what she described later as an intellectual vertigo, where she realized that all the things that she had held most dear morally weren't supported by her atheism. And that started her on a kind of journey of exploration, which ended in her becoming a Christian. So I'll tell these stories, or in Francis Collins, the most senior scientist in America, who's the head of the National Institute of Health here, who, again, was an atheist when he was a student at Yale, and then became a Christian when he was a junior doctor after a not very educated woman who was in severe ongoing pain and crying out to Jesus, shared her faith with him, and then said, "Doctor, what do you believe?" And that kind of got him thinking and reading and researching, and ended in him becoming a Christian. So I think sometimes people are helped by our own personal stories, for sure, but actually we can also kind of borrow other people's stories,
of course,
to help them see, oh, maybe Christianity isn't disproved by science. If the top scientist in America became a Christian, maybe Christianity isn't the enemy of human rights. If somebody whose expertise is like in history of thought became a Christian by that way, maybe Christianity isn't the most offensive idea to somebody in a gay or lesbian relationship, but actually could be their lifeline of hope.
So that's really helpful. Perhaps just because we've kept you trespassed on your time long enough. Just on a personal note, for these last 3 to 6 months of lockdown, all the uncertainty, how have you and the family found that? What maybe some of the highs and lows that you've experienced?
There was a low point for me toward the beginning when it seemed like just more and more things were shutting down. So it was like, school shut down, meeting with church in person shut down, having play dates outside with friends seemed unwise. And I kind of felt like, oh my goodness, we're on this trajectory to where it's only going to be me and my immediate family. Now, I'm super thankful that there are 4 other humans who live in my house, and I have single friends who that's a much harder reality. But I'm also an off the charts extrovert, and I really need my friends. So the idea of kind of not physically seeing anyone in person was hard for me. Before long, it got to the point where I thought, what, I think actually we can have socially distant outdoor play dates with friends. And as the summer has unfolded here, wear a mask outside, interact, like be wise as you interact with people, but it doesn't mean I've had to kind of completely shut off all social contact. And so that's been super helpful. I would say on the scale of how this has affected people, I've been incredibly fortunate. I've been able to continue writing, doing, all my travel for speaking stopped, but actually I've been able to continue to speak online. I've given talks for churches in Australia and in India and in the UK, and there's something nice about the fact that suddenly everywhere in the world is kind of equally accessible.
Yeah. Geography is the meaning of geography has changed, hasn't it?
Indeed. So that's been good. I feel very thankful for the community that I have here, and not just my immediate family, but also friends.
And in those sort of low moments that you kind of experienced earlier on, are you able to share at all anything about how being a Christian, trusting Jesus, how that helped in those low moments?
Yeah, I think it helps in 2 big ways. One is knowing Romans 8:28 is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Now, that doesn't mean every day is going to be a happy day and things are always going to work out our way. In fact, the context of that is being conformed to the likeness of Christ, who, in case anyone missed the memo, went to the cross. But it does mean that at the end of the day, our story will be incredibly happy. And, you know, when all's said and done, it's going to be great. Or as the Lego film puts it, everything is awesome. So there was that big picture. Whatever happens now, everything is awesome in the end. I had a few clarifying moments as well of because you know, in the US in particular, we have the combination of the coronavirus sort of sweeping everything, like unsettling everything. We've had the protests arising out of George Floyd's murder and other acts of police brutality toward Black Americans, and we have a president who I have always worried could honestly lead America into a war through sheer, you know, foolish talk of various sorts. And I was thinking to myself, the first Christians lived in a world where they had nothing like the security that you and I have come to expect. Nothing like the sense that actually, you know, however much they might disagree with the government, there was a sort of basic level of peacefulness, and that they weren't going to be, you know, hauled in the streets and stoned and executed, because often they were, you know, all these sorts of things.
Yes.
And I thought, as we do family Bible times every day, and as I was, you know, doing that with the kids, it felt more precious because we weren't able to meet with the church at large every Sunday. It also sort of reminded me, like, there is a non-zero possibility that Brian and I will be discipling our kids through a period of extraordinary unrest. I mean, whether it's like, I'm not trying to be alarmist here, but these are the combinations of kinds of things that do end up causing like civil wars and who knows what. Like, if you look back at history, the sort of combination of government and virus and there's a potential perfect storm here. And, you know, there's a moment of that's like, oh gosh, that's terrifying. But then a moment of thinking, those circumstances would actually be really clarifying to us as Christians, because if we, in cultures where it's sort of easy to say that you're a Christian, no real cost to going to church, possibly people may not like you as much at work because some of the beliefs you hold are unpopular, but really it's not so bad, contrasted with the early church and what many of our brothers and sisters globally experience, which is, you know, proper persecution. To think, actually, there are some very kind of clarifying things in the midst of that, where we need to ask ourselves, are we with Jesus or are we not? And if there is a real cost to being with Jesus, are we still with Jesus or are we not?
A real cost.
I hope I'm still with Jesus.
Yeah, a real cost and a real hope. Well, Rebecca, that has been so delightful, so encouraging. Is there anything else that you would want to share with us from your vantage point in the States, looking back over to the UK? Anything that you might want to encourage us with in our task?
Yeah, I'm a massive gospel optimist, which is not to say that everyone in the UK or the US is going to suddenly give their lives to Jesus tomorrow, but the extent to which other options are bankrupt is becoming increasingly clear. There are real, I mean, I think I grew up in a world where, as I said earlier, the general idea was that Christianity is almost certainly untrue and probably not good for you anyway. Turns out it's actually really good for you in terms of your mental and physical health. I mean, a Harvard study a couple of years ago showed that women who go to church once a week or more here are 5 times less likely to kill themselves than women who never go. And if you want to talk about suicide prevention, or if you want to talk about mental health, or if you want to talk about general self-reported happiness, or if you want to talk about levels of charitable giving or volunteering, etc., 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 actually going to church every week is incredibly beneficial. now that's not the reason that we believe in Jesus, but it is a way to undercut this idea that really the world would be better off without Christianity. And I think increasingly people are finding themselves in the midst of despair, and that we do have a hope to share. And I always want to be careful saying that, of course, Christians also can suffer with depression and even suicidal thoughts. And we're not promised that any of those sort of burdens will be lifted from us. Some of the greatest sort of heroes of the faith throughout history have struggled in those ways. But I think we do have a hope, a unique and compelling hope, and one that, far from having been intellectually discredited, is actually believed by some of the top thinkers in every field that is supposed to have disproved the Christian faith.
That's amazing. Thank you. Why don't I pray for you as we kind of draw our time together to a close? Let me pray for you. Our dear Heavenly Father, we just want to pause before you and thank you. Thank you for your gospel message. We thank you for that message of hope, that you didn't leave us, you didn't abandon us when we turned our backs on you, but instead you sent your son to live with us, as us, and to die in our place, taking the punishment, the penalty that we deserved. And thank you for that message of hope. We thank you for the way it's touched Rebecca and her life. We thank you for the way it is shaping her and her family, and the message that she's so keen to share. Thank you for all the things she's learned, all the ways in which she's able to share it, and all the people she knows whose ideas and understanding she can pass on to others. Father, we pray for her now. We pray that you would continue to encourage her and strengthen her and give her wisdom and insight as she continues to speak for you. And Father, we pray that many people would be blessed and equipped to speak for you because of the work that you're doing through her just now, Father. So we lift all these things to you. We commit Rebecca and her family to you, and we pray that you bless her, continue to bless her work. In Jesus' name, amen.